Hi, my name is Steve Chizmar, and I'm the Bureau Director of PennDOT's Bureau of Innovations. It is my pleasure to host a series of podcasts celebrating the 10th anniversary of Pennsylvania's State Transportation Innovation Council, or STIC for short. The first installment of the STIC's 10th year anniversary podcast series focuses on the origins and early beginnings of the PA STIC, which was established in 2012 and held its first business meeting in March of that same year. Today, I am speaking with Clint Beck, Director of Programs and Performance Management at the Federal Highway Administration PA Division Office. Clint, welcome.
Hi, Steve. Thanks so much for having me on today.
Clint, can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and what your involvement was, particularly with the early days of the Pennsylvania STIC?
Sure. Yeah, you hit it right on. I'm the Director of Programs and Performance Management in the Federal Highway Pennsylvania Division. So my team covers safety, pavement, bridge, civil rights, right-of-way, traffic operations. It's a pretty diverse group that I have there. I started with Federal Highway in the Pennsylvania Division in 2010 as a transportation engineer after spending 10 years with PennDOT. So got about 20 some years of experience with the transportation industry. So when the Pennsylvania STIC was first created, this is around 2012. So it was shortly after I came to Federal Highway, and there was a lot of things going on at the time. Federal Highway had just launched the Everyday Counts initiative, and then we also were working on the State Transportation Innovation Council's effort. So what happened is early in 2012, as the STIC was being created, part of the idea was to set up technical advisory groups for a variety of different topics. And one of those topics was maintenance. And having come from PennDOT, and Federal Highway usually doesn't deal with maintenance, I was sort of picked to help work on the maintenance tag. So we were introduced to the idea of the STIC and what it was, all the new kind of tag facilitators on the PennDOT side and the Federal Highway side, and what it was and what we were going to do to help facilitate that effort. So, like I said, along with Daryl St. Clair from PennDOT, we started the maintenance tag, and in June of 2012, we had our first kind of kickoff conference call. We had some maintenance folks on from some different districts and even some folks from private sector. And that's how it sort of started off, and that's how we got going. There was kind of some excitement there, mixed with some confusion as to what we were doing and why we were doing it and what our roles were. But those were the early days, and that's how we got started.
Well, thanks, Clint. Let me ask you to look at this a little more broadly. Obviously you were involved with the maintenance tag early on, but what was the original vision for the STIC?
Well, I think the original vision was, we knew there was innovations all over the country. We knew there was innovations within Pennsylvania, and there was procedures out there to get these ideas put into place, but we wanted, to take advantage of moving them much faster. So the idea was if we could put together a group, this innovation council that could look at these different ideas from all over the place and vet them, and say, are these truly ready to go and ready to implement? And if they are, what are we waiting for? Kind of that group would have the authority to say, yep, that sounds like a good innovation. We think it's going to be beneficial. The Pennsylvania STIC, is it beneficial to Pennsylvania? Yes. And okay, let's cut some red tape and move these right up through into implementation. So it was an area where PennDOT had a lot of things set up for implementation of new ideas, but this was the fast track version of that. Get that blessing right away from some top leadership and move forward. So that was the vision we were looking at is, how do we move things much faster through the process?
Well, yeah, and clearly, we've grown from those early days, and I think that vision is still kind of the hallmark of the direction that we're heading, and as far as adopting the innovations and moving them through more quickly. And clearly the Pennsylvania STIC has been a success. I mean, here we are 10 years later, but can you tell us what were some of the larger hurdles faced in creating the original PA STIC?
Sure, absolutely. Because with any new change or new thing, there's always going to be hurdles. Um, I think one of the ones was organizing such a large group of various stakeholders. I think there was some big vision out there. Oh, we're gonna if we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this big, and so we're gonna get a lot of people involved. And I was maintenance, but there was design tag, there was environment tag, there was safety tag. So all these different people that you had to kind of explain why are we even doing this, and what's the process, what are the roles that we each play, who's doing this. There was, like I said, there was some private sector folks in, we had academia, and people had a lot of questions. How's this different than our current process, of implementing improvements? We already do this, don't we? Are we volunteers? The classic, is this part of our job, or did you just add another thing that I've got to work on to my job? um, and then for me, who had just learned about federal highway and everyday counts, I'm like, well, is this just for everyday counts, or are we allowed to do other innovations? And then we had a lot of folks say, well, I've got a research idea. And, it was kind of explaining, is it research? Is it new ideas? Is it, what is it? So I think those were some of the biggest hurdles up front, is just getting everybody to understand what niche we were trying to fill that didn't exist in the current processes. It wasn't replacing research. It wasn't replacing some of the quality assurance groups. It was a new process. And yes, in a lot of ways, we were all volunteers. And yes, it was an extra thing to do on top of what we were already doing, but it was worthwhile. So I think that was some of the bigger hurdles, is just that large group and getting them sort of all headed in the right direction.
Well, thank you for that insight. Yeah, yeah, and that was the thing about the PA stick, and it still is today, is it really brought together a diverse group of folks. I mean, you had PennDOT, you had the Federal Highway Administration, Turnpike, private sector, and clearly it's paying off. We're today we're finally reaping the rewards from just a lot of work early on. Clint, with that in mind, what advice would you give another state, or even a similar PA state agency, who may try to establish a similar innovations council?
Yeah, and first off, I definitely would encourage them to go for it, because, as you said, that the dividends are paying off in the end. But first and foremost, and I think our group did a pretty good job of this, even though we had some of the hiccups, was, define the processes for the stick and the roles for those participants. Um, but don't let your current processes slow you down. The current processes that most agencies have or states have are good. They're valid for what you're trying to do, and define new processes for this new kind of effort of moving innovations, more quickly up to the top, and getting them implemented. Um, the other advice I would give you is find a way to handle all the ideas. When you have something called innovation and you get people in a room, everybody wants to shout ideas out. You're brainstorming, things are coming out, what's going to happen. And what I saw sometimes is we would reject ideas. We'd be like, no, that's not a proven idea. It's not ready to implement. And that sort of toned down the energy in the room. So I think that's actually one of the things that changed with the stick, is the ability to handle those and hand those off. So I think, as a new agency, or if you want to try this out, again, define those processes, define the roles for participants. They know what they're doing when they're coming together. Um, and find a way, and whatever ideas you get, gather them up. And you might not necessarily move them all up through the stick for implementation, but you might move some over to a research group, or you might move some over to another area. So I think those are kind of the two hallmarks of a good implementation of a new innovation council, is to keep the excitement and energy of new ideas, and then have those processes sort of defined and the roles defined.
Well, Clint, as you said, when the stick was just starting here in Pennsylvania, you were jumping into a new role at the Federal Highway Administration. So, clearly you had a lot of things going on. But let me ask you to put that way back hat on for a second. And can you tell us what was your most memorable moment during your involvement with the stick, either in those early days or even recently?
I have to go back to when the Pennsylvania stick was recognized nationally as a leader and a role model for others. We were putting this together. We were just doing our job, right? It got started. People said, "Hey, this is a way to get stuff moving," and we're like, "This is great. This is an awesome idea." It was going well. we were all coordinating on the tags, and then we would feed those up through the STIC. There were some procedures in place, and things were moving along. Ideas were flowing, but we didn't really know where we were, compared to other states and what was happening. And when that we were recognized nationally, it was like, oh wow, we hit the ground running. We're at the forefront of this, and others are looking at us as a role model. So that was sort of a pat on the back to everybody that was involved in that hey, we did a good job with this, and it happened. So I sort of remember that moment. It was like, hey, this the effort paid off, and we're at the forefront, which we like to be here in Pennsylvania.
And hopefully we'll stay at the forefront. And I'll tell you what, it's one of those things where we continue to meet with other states about how the stick is working and why it works so well here in PA. But we'll actually get to that a little bit later. Um, speaking about the innovations that have passed through the stick, do any of those particularly stand out to you in terms of benefits to Pennsylvania? And if so, why is that?
Yes, Steve. So this is going to be maybe cliche, but being in the maintenance tag, one of the ideas that we had was LED lighting. And so there you have it, literally the symbol of a bright idea, a light bulb. And that was one of the innovations that was coming through. And I think on the surface, when the idea came up, it was, well, you just change the light bulb, right? So how many engineers does it take to change a light bulb? But there's going through it and the process that we had set up with the tag to actually analyze this, the why, the who, what's innovative about this. There was a lot of things to consider, from initial costs, light output levels, pole spacing, um, environmental impacts, et cetera. So I think what's nice, again, it symbolizes that bright idea, which goes well with innovation, but it also, we talked about benefits to Pennsylvania. It's there's cost savings. That's, people put LEDs in their own houses because there's a cost savings long term. Might cost more upfront, but over time, there's a lot of savings to be had. That savings of money, which is any state DOT would be welcome to have, or even municipality, also reflects an energy savings. And so, as in a world that we live in, we're trying to reduce the amount of energy we use as humanity. This is a benefit there. Um, and then an area that's sort of near and dear to what my group currently does is safety. Can these LEDs can improve safety for drivers, pedestrians, safety for maintenance workers, in the sense that literally you don't have to change the light bulb as often, and they're not out there in harm's way. So there's a safety benefit to it. And then on the environmental side, with the LED light bulbs, you actually have little more ability to direct where that light goes. You think about lights on a bridge or in an interchange, and there's adjacent forest land or rivers, and those aquatic habitats, bats in particular, that might be attracted because of the insects that are attracted to light. So you can sort of direct where the light goes, a little more control. So LED light bulbs, a simple thing, but I just find it fascinating, like how important it is, and all the kind of the far-reaching benefits. So I think that would have to be the top one I like that stands out to me.
It's interesting because I think I've actually just recently changed the last incandescent bulb in my house. So even they're all LED now. So
Yep.
we're actually moving in the right direction on the home front too. Clint, we talked earlier about the stick, how it brought together like such a diverse group of individuals and teams and organizations. What I want to ask you too, why is collaboration so important in helping to advance innovations? Why was it so important that we brought that group together?
Yeah, and I think I'll start with kind of the foundation, and that's like collaboration. That's that coordinated effort to make sure we look at everything from all different perspectives and end up with the best end product, right? And so everything we do in the transportation sector requires collaboration, not just innovation. It's built into the process for so many things that we do as we try and improve our procedures, even as we deliver projects, because we have to make sure what we're doing, we're using taxpayer dollars as wisely as we can, and we're providing the services that the public needs. That said, when you're advancing innovations, you're doing this in an accelerated pace. So then the collaboration is even more critical. You don't want to miss, having that collaboration where you have a couple people in the room coordinating, well, who's doing what, well, how do you look at it? If you're the designer who has to implement this idea, what's important to you? If you're the contractor who's got to build this new thing that we're going to implement? What are you looking at? So having a bunch of people all collaborating on what this idea is and how we can look at it from a bunch of different perspectives, so that when it comes out at the end and we say, yeah, we're going to implement this, there's not hiccups in the road, and there's not bumps in the road as it gets implemented. So I think that collaboration gets even more important when you move advancing innovations kind of through this accelerated process, because there's a chance to miss that collaboration and then have a mistake be made. So I think the procedures that were set up, created that collaboration at the tag level and at the stick level. So I think it's a critical part of anything in transportation, but even more so when it comes to innovation and moving things quickly through those processes.
Hey, Clint, earlier you had mentioned about the original award that the PA STIC has won, being recognized as a national leader. I mean, we've won several awards, I think, since then. And the Pennsylvania STIC has been held up numerous times as a model for success. Let me ask you a two-part question. First of all, what do you think makes the Pennsylvania STIC stand out from the rest? And secondly, why has it been so successful here in PA?
Yeah, I think a few things that stand out, and maybe this is back to some other things I've said here. It's how quickly the Pennsylvania STIC was initiated and got to work. Um, a lot of folks, that credit goes to those who created that concept and worked between Federal Highway and PennDOT to launch the initiative. But those initial processes and procedures and the idea for it was sort of laid out in a nice, concise outline that you could bring the folks together that had to implement it and say, here's what we're going to do. Even though we had a lot of questions, he was able to do it very fast. It was, hey, we're going to do this quick. We're going to get these meetings. We're going to get started. So I think it stands out initially, certainly, in how quickly we stood up and were successful immediately at the outset. And another thing that really, I think the Pennsylvania STIC stands out is how broadly it covers all areas. Like I said, we had tags for like 8 different areas. And then at the STIC level, we've got DCNR and other agencies involved, so we can share things across agencies and across platforms and across ideas. And I know ideas and innovations have moved from one tag to the other. So I think the broadness of it and the speed is a lot of what makes it different than maybe some other STICs even today that have stood up in other states where they focused on one element, design or whatever it is. So a lot of what has contributed to the success, I would say, was the structure, that great foundation that was created initially. Like, what is it, why we were doing it, and how we were going to do it was all laid out before we even had the first tag meeting. So when people were brought in and said, hey, you're going to have this extra work, they understood right away why it was important, and they understood what they needed to do. Even though, like I said, we had questions, there was answers for a lot of those questions, and that made us successful right away. The thing that has kept us successful and kept the momentum, I think, is the foresight of those that are running the STIC and behind the scenes, making sure the meetings go off without a hitch, and the willingness and ability to evolve, to say, just because we did well in 2012 and 13 and got out the gates fast doesn't mean that's the perfect process. So that process I've seen evolve and improve over the past 10 years. And so I think that's the success of almost any organization, is the ability to change and improve over time. And I've seen the changes happen as I've been on the different tags and sat on the STIC at different times in different venues. So I think those are the things that make it so successful.
Thanks, Clint. Yeah, Clint, clearly it seems clear. I'm sorry. It seems clear that innovation is key to advancing a robust transportation system, on a multimodal transportation system, if you will, roads, bridges, public transportation. And clearly this STIC moved innovation in that direction, helped to advance innovations through the process. Let's look more holistically now. What do you think are some of the larger challenges that are facing the transportation industry in Pennsylvania? And how can innovation help address those challenges as we move forward?
Yeah, Steve, there's so many challenges. And so, the larger challenges that I see, that the two big ones that stand out to me are safety and funding. So I'll start with safety, and we all want our transportation system to be 100% safe. But the terrible reality is, we're not very close to 100% safe as a vision. And innovation has helped transportation get safer. Vehicles have improved. We've got seat belts, crumple zones, airbags. Those are all the result of innovation. But more things that maybe a state DOT controls, our roads have improved. We have guide rail and all kinds of different impact attenuators. More recently, a favorite, high friction surface treatment. It's a treatment on roadways that as you go around a curve, if you would normally have maybe slid off and hit a tree, with the additional friction of that surface treatment, you don't. And so lives are saved there. We're seeing innovation happen before our eyes in terms of driving systems, whether you call them automated driving or self-driving, or even just the crash avoidance systems. These things are happening within vehicles, but also, again, for a state DOT that deals with roadway design, you have roundabouts, which maybe aren't innovative anymore because we've been doing them for so long. Diverging diamonds, other design methodologies that have come around, innovative intersections. So I think innovation is the path to solving our safety issues of today, and moving us to that zero deaths vision. And that's how we're going to get there. And those are just some examples of where we got to today. And I think that's what it's going to take moving forward. So safety, super important, but funding also is critical. And funding is huge, and it's not just in Pennsylvania, it's everywhere. This is a struggle. And it's a two-part effort, and we've seen Pennsylvania do a lot of things on these two. So the first part of that effort is always looking internally and what can an agency do to be more effective with the available funding that they have, through improving their current processes and just getting better at what they do. The other part is to figure out what we're going to do to fund transportation as we move away from gasoline-powered vehicles and the gas tax. I'm not going to touch that one today. I'll let that second part to the experts on what is going on in terms of there's certainly will be a lot of innovation in terms of the how we get more funding in. But I would say on the innovation of current improvements and current processes, absolutely, there's a lot to be done there. I look at it, it may seem like a pretty standard process, but asset management, I'm seeing amazing innovations in the technology, that what we're able to do with the data we have today to pick even better projects and do a better job of getting the right treatment to the right road at the right time. There's innovation there, and that means we stretch the taxpayer dollars out even further and get better conditions for the same amount of funding. And I think that goes whether it's in a design area or a construction innovation. Those things help us stretch those dollars, make the products that we build last longer, make them safer. So I think innovation is the key to moving us and addressing those two big challenges of safety and funding.
Thank you, Clint. Excuse me, I'm always amazed at how quickly these half-hour time slots fill up. I mean, we could talk for easily an hour about innovation and about the STIC. But as we move forward, as we prepare to wrap up this most recent edition, I want you to think more broadly in terms of, and actually more broadly about the future of transportation, but also coming back to the STIC. Any thoughts on where you think the STIC will be in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I really think the STIC will likely continue to fill this role of identifying proven innovations and moving them quickly through the implementation pipeline. We see a lot of ideas graduating from research, or there's unproven ideas that are being piloted today, and are being shown to be effective. And all these ideas that are moving through and that start as research are now in that pipeline of now they need to be implemented. They need to be discovered and moved up and put into practice. And the STIC fills that role. So I think that, there'll be new faces, there'll be new processes, and we'll get better at how we share and collaborate. But in general, I think the STIC, will continue to be a permanent entity for the foreseeable future because that pipeline of new innovations will always be backfilled with more new innovations that need to be moved up quickly through implementation. So I really see in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have new faces on the team and we're going to have new processes for doing what we do. But that general concept, I think, is going to stand the test of time because it's so important.
And again, we've been speaking with Clint Beck, Director of Programs and Performance Management for the Federal Highway Administration. Clint, thank you. Before we wrap up, is there anything I'm missing? Anything that you wish I would have asked?
Well, we covered a range of topics, and like you said, we could talk for hours about all the innovations that have moved through the STIC through the years. But I think it was a great chance to look back on the struggles and the successes of the past decade. And I just thank you, Steve, for allowing me to kind of go back memory lane and enjoy this with you. So thank you. Nothing more to add.
Thank you for joining us today and for helping us celebrate the PA STIC's 10th anniversary and its efforts to develop and deploy innovations across Pennsylvania. Visit www.penndot.pa.gov/STIC to learn more about the PA STIC and how we are innovating transportation in Pennsylvania.